"You don't belong in this hotel." The words landed with the cold certainty of someone who believed they had the right to decide who deserved respect. They echoed beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Grand Meridian Hotel at exactly 8:42 on a bright Monday morning, freezing conversations across the marble lobby as rolling suitcases slowed, coffee cups paused halfway to waiting lips, and curious eyes drifted toward the woman standing alone near the revolving doors. Naomi Brooks didn't react. She simply looked at the man who had spoken as though she were studying a problem that had already solved itself. She wore dark jeans, clean white sneakers, and a fitted black sweater beneath a light charcoal jacket. There were no designer logos, no sparkling jewelry, no security detail following behind her. Just a slim leather tablet case resting comfortably against her side, and the kind of calm that couldn't be purchased or performed. Greg Harrison, the hotel manager, folded his arms across his navy blazer and forced a polite smile that never reached his eyes. "Our luxury guests use the main entrance after verification," he said, his voice louder now, making certain nearby visitors could hear every word. "Service entrances are around the corner." A few people exchanged uneasy glances. One elderly couple stopped beside the concierge desk. A businessman waiting for his rideshare quietly lowered his phone. No one spoke. They simply watched. Naomi tilted her head ever so slightly. "I'm here to check something," she answered in an even tone. "Then you'll need to check somewhere else," Greg replied. "People wander into expensive hotels every day pretending they belong." His words drifted through the lobby like smoke, impossible to ignore. A young front desk associate named Emily Carter looked up from her monitor. She had been with the hotel for less than 3 weeks, but something about the woman standing in front of the entrance felt strangely familiar. Not her face exactly. Her confidence. The effortless way she stood without shrinking beneath unwanted attention. Emily glanced toward the reservation system before Greg's sharp voice pulled her attention back. "Don't waste your time," he muttered to the staff. "She's not on any guest list worth checking." Naomi didn't argue. She didn't demand respect. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she slowly removed her phone, unlocked the screen, and typed a single short message before slipping it back into her pocket. Hundreds of miles away, Rachel Evans looked down at her phone during the middle of a corporate meeting. The notification appeared with only 3 words. Protocol 7. Rachel stood without saying a word, collected her tablet, and quietly walked out of the conference room. Back inside the Grand Meridian, Greg mistook Naomi's silence for surrender. He stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound rehearsed rather than emotional. "This property has standards," he said. "We protect our guests from uncomfortable situations." Naomi met his eyes without blinking. "Is that what you think you're doing?" she asked softly. Greg smiled. "Absolutely." Around them, the atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly. Guests who had intended to walk away remained exactly where they were. A bellman slowed his luggage cart. Emily glanced once more at her monitor, her fingers hovering above the keyboard as an uneasy feeling settled in her chest. Something about this morning no longer felt ordinary. Somewhere beyond the polished glass walls, dark clouds began gathering over the skyline. But inside the lobby, an even larger storm had already arrived, and only one person standing there knew exactly how the next 8 minutes would end. Greg Harrison glanced toward the revolving doors with the quiet confidence of a man who believed the conversation was already over. "I suggest you leave before this becomes embarrassing," he said, folding his hands in front of him as though he were offering professional advice instead of an insult. Naomi Brooks simply nodded once. "I asked to speak with the manager," she replied. Greg let out a short laugh. "You are speaking with the manager." The answer drew a few awkward smiles from nearby guests, although most remained silent, unsure whether they were witnessing an ordinary disagreement or something far more serious. Emily Carter lowered her eyes toward the reservation system again. Curiosity outweighed hesitation. She quietly searched the executive access directory while pretending to organize arrivals for the morning. Before she could finish, Greg noticed her fingers moving across the keyboard. "Emily," he said firmly, "focus on confirmed guests." She immediately stopped typing, but the incomplete search stayed in the back of her mind. Naomi stood exactly where she was. She neither stepped forward nor backed away. Her patience seemed to irritate Greg even more than an argument would have. Security will escort you outside if necessary, he said. This lobby is reserved for paying guests and authorized visitors. Naomi answered with the same steady voice she had used since walking through the doors. Interesting policy. Greg smiled. It has worked very well for us. Across the lobby, a middle-aged man wearing an expensive gray suit looked over with an amused expression. People really do try anything these days, he muttered loudly enough for others to hear. Another guest frowned but remained silent. Emily noticed the uncomfortable expressions spreading across the room. The atmosphere no longer resembled the welcoming luxury experience displayed in the hotel's advertisements. It felt tense, uncertain, almost fragile. Naomi reached into her jacket pocket and calmly removed her driver's license. Instead of examining it, Greg barely glanced at the card before holding it between two fingers. Identification can be borrowed, he said casually. Confidence can be faked too. Naomi looked directly at him. Do you always make decisions before checking the facts? Greg ignored the question. Until we verify everything, I will keep this. He slipped the identification behind the front desk without asking permission. Emily looked up immediately. Even two experienced front desk associates exchanged uncertain glances. Holding a guest's identification without explanation was unusual, especially before verifying anything. Naomi remained perfectly composed. I would like my identification returned. Greg shook his head. After verification, the businessman in the gray suit chuckled again. That seems reasonable to me. Naomi turned slightly toward the lobby windows, almost as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. Several seconds later, her phone vibrated softly. She looked at the screen for only an instant before placing it back into her pocket. The message contained just 4 words from Rachel Evans. Corporate team is ready. Naomi's expression never changed. Greg interpreted her silence as defeat and relaxed his shoulders. There is still time to leave with your dignity, he said. Naomi answered quietly. Dignity is not something another person can give me or take away. Emily felt a chill despite the comfortable temperature inside the lobby. She looked once more toward the executive directory, remembering a photograph she had seen during orientation. The image had flashed across the training presentation for only a few seconds, but the calm face standing across the lobby now seemed impossible to forget. She could not yet explain why, but the uneasy feeling inside her continued to grow stronger with every passing moment, while everyone else remained unaware that the balance of power had already begun shifting beneath their feet. The uneasy silence finally broke when Greg reached beneath the front desk and pressed a small button hidden beside the monitor. Less than 10 seconds later, a uniformed security officer emerged from a hallway near the elevators and walked toward the center of the lobby with measured steps. Guests instinctively shifted aside, creating a wide circle around Naomi without anyone saying a word. Greg gestured confidently. This guest has refused to cooperate with hotel procedures, he announced. Please escort her outside until her identity can be verified. Naomi looked at the security officer before calmly asking, Have you been told what happened, or only what someone wants you to believe? The officer hesitated for the briefest moment. Before he could answer, Greg interrupted. The details are not important. She does not have authorization to remain here. Naomi smiled politely. Interesting. You reached that conclusion without verifying anything. Greg folded his arms again. Experience teaches you to recognize certain situations immediately. The words lingered in the air. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, sensing there was more behind that sentence than simple hotel policy. The businessman in the gray suit stepped forward with a faint grin. Honestly, the manager is just protecting the property. Luxury hotels cannot let anyone wander in pretending to belong. Naomi turned toward him with complete composure. Have you ever been asked to prove you belonged before anyone even learned your name? The man opened his mouth, then quietly looked away. Emily Carter could no longer ignore the feeling growing inside her. While Greg focused on the gathering crowd, she discreetly reopened the executive directory and completed the search she had abandoned minutes earlier. Her heartbeat quickened. A single profile appeared with restricted access. The photograph was small, but unmistakable. Naomi Brooks, executive owner clearance. Emily stared at the screen, blinking twice as if expecting it to disappear. Instead, another notice appeared beneath the profile. Owner-level access. Corporate authorization required. She quickly minimized the page before anyone noticed, but her hands were no longer steady. Across the lobby, Naomi remained perfectly calm. Her patience seemed almost impossible to understand. She neither defended herself nor accused anyone. She simply watched events unfold exactly as if they were following a schedule only she understood. Her phone vibrated again. Rachel Evans had sent another short message. Regional director is on the way. Estimated arrival, 6 minutes. Naomi read it once and slipped the phone back into her pocket. Greg noticed the movement and laughed softly. Calling someone to rescue you. Naomi answered without hesitation. No, I am giving people an opportunity to make better decisions. Greg shook his head. You still think this ends in your favor? Naomi's voice remained gentle. Every decision leaves a record. Some are written on paper. Others are written in character. Emily slowly looked up from her monitor. She glanced from Naomi to Greg, then back to the executive profile, still hidden behind another window on her screen. Her training had taught her that hospitality began with respect. What she was witnessing looked nothing like the values displayed during orientation. A woman standing near the concierge desk quietly whispered to her husband. She has not raised her voice once. He nodded. Neither would I if I knew something everyone else did not. The security officer shifted uneasily, no longer certain he understood the situation he had entered. Greg, however, mistook every moment of silence for agreement. He stood taller, convinced the lobby remained under his control, completely unaware that the first undeniable crack in his authority had already appeared on the screen directly in front of one frightened young employee. Emily Carter stared at the hidden executive profile for another heartbeat before quietly locking her screen. Her pulse was racing now. During orientation, new employees had spent less than 5 minutes reviewing photographs of senior leadership. Most people had forgotten them before lunch. Emily had not. She remembered faces. More importantly, she remembered names. Naomi Brooks, founder, chief executive officer, owner-level authorization. She slowly lifted her eyes toward the woman standing calmly in the center of the lobby and realized she was looking at the same person from the presentation. Her stomach tightened. Sir, Emily said carefully, hoping her voice would not shake. I think we should verify her profile through corporate before asking her to leave. Greg turned toward her with visible irritation. You are still in training, he replied sharply. I am not asking for advice. Emily swallowed. I believe I saw her name in the executive directory. Greg laughed loud enough for nearby guests to hear. The executive directory is restricted. You did not see anything. Emily hesitated only a moment before answering. I believe I did. The lobby grew noticeably quieter. Several guests exchanged curious looks. Naomi remained exactly where she was, watching the exchange without interruption. Greg stepped closer to the front desk. Close your system and stop creating confusion, he ordered. We have already determined the situation. Emily looked from Greg to Naomi and back again. With respect, I do not think we have. Greg's expression hardened. Do you want your first month here to become your last? The words hung in the air. Emily lowered her eyes for a second, gathering the courage she did not know she possessed. I only want us to be certain before we make a mistake. Naomi watched the young employee with quiet appreciation, but said nothing. She understood exactly how much courage that single sentence required. Across the lobby, the businessman in the gray suit folded his newspaper and frowned. If she says there is a record, why not check it? He asked. Another guest nodded. Verification seems easier than making assumptions. Greg immediately answered. Certain records cannot be discussed publicly. Hotel policy. Naomi tilted her head slightly. Policy should protect people, not replace judgment. Greg ignored her. Instead, he pointed toward the security officer. Please escort her outside while we finish our review. The officer shifted uneasily, but did not move. Something about the conversation no longer felt routine. He looked toward Emily. Is there actually an executive record? Emily hesitated. Greg answered before she could speak. There is nothing relevant. Emily took a slow breath. There is a record, she said quietly. I cannot see everything because of the access restrictions, but I saw enough to know we should stop. For the first time since the confrontation began, Greg's confidence flickered. It lasted less than a second before he recovered. You are mistaken. Emily gently shook her head. I do not think I am. Naomi's phone vibrated once more. Rachel Evans had sent another brief update. Regional director entering the property. For minutes, Naomi slipped the phone back into her pocket without looking surprised. The clock above the concierge desk continued its steady movement, each passing second carrying the lobby closer to a truth that could no longer be delayed. Around them, guests who had originally intended to check in, collect their keys, and continue with their morning remained exactly where they stood, sensing they were about to witness something far more significant than an ordinary disagreement at a luxury hotel. Greg Harrison glanced around the lobby and noticed the growing number of eyes fixed on him. What had begun as a routine display of authority no longer felt quite as comfortable, yet pride refused to let him retreat. "Enough of this," he declared. "This conversation is finished." He looked toward the security officer again. "Escort her outside." The officer remained where he stood. "Sir, I would prefer to wait until corporate verifies the information." Greg's jaw tightened. "I am corporate in this building." Naomi Brooks finally spoke after several long moments of silence. "That is an interesting way to describe responsibility." Greg answered immediately. "Responsibility means protecting standards." Naomi looked around the elegant lobby, taking in the polished marble floors, the fresh flowers arranged beside the reception desk, and the guests who had stopped whatever they were doing to watch the exchange unfold. "No," she said quietly. "Responsibility means protecting people." Those words seemed to settle over the room with more weight than anyone expected. Emily Carter felt her heartbeat slow as certainty replaced doubt. She knew she had seen the truth on her screen. The question was no longer whether Naomi belonged there. The question was how much damage had already been done before anyone bothered to verify the facts. Naomi lowered her eyes for just a moment, and an old memory surfaced with surprising clarity. 15 years earlier, she had stood in another luxury hotel, wearing the only business suit she could afford after months of saving every extra dollar. She had arrived early for an investment meeting that could have changed her future, but before she even reached the front desk, someone had assumed she was lost and directed her toward a service entrance. No one had asked her name. No one had looked at her invitation. They had only looked at her. She remembered leaving that building with disappointment in her heart, but determination stronger than ever. On the drive home, she made herself a promise. One day she would build places where dignity would never depend on appearance, clothing, or assumptions. That promise had guided every hotel her company opened across the country. Returning to the present, Naomi looked calmly at Greg. "Can I ask you one question?" Greg shrugged. "If it helps you understand why this is necessary." Naomi nodded. "What exactly convinced you that I did not belong here?" Greg answered without hesitation. "Experience." Naomi's expression remained peaceful. Experience should teach wisdom, not prejudice. Several guests exchanged thoughtful glances. Even the businessman who had defended Greg earlier no longer seemed comfortable with the conversation. He quietly folded his newspaper and stepped back without another word. Emily noticed another employee at the concierge desk discreetly lowering her eyes, embarrassed by what everyone was witnessing. Greg sensed the mood beginning to shift and spoke louder, hoping confidence alone would restore control. "People like you always believe the rules should change for them." The sentence lingered in the silence that followed. No one applauded. No one agreed. Naomi simply looked at him with genuine sadness rather than anger. "The rules never concerned me," she replied softly. "Only the assumptions." At that exact moment, the elevator reserved for executive access chimed somewhere beyond the lobby doors. Few people paid attention to the sound, but Naomi recognized it immediately. Without checking her phone or glancing toward the hallway, she knew the next chapter of the morning had already arrived, and for the first time since she walked through those front doors, the balance of power was no longer invisible. It was only seconds away from revealing itself to everyone in the room. The soft chime from the executive elevator faded into the background, unnoticed by almost everyone except Naomi Brooks. She remained perfectly still, her composure untouched, while events far beyond the lobby began moving with remarkable speed. Hundreds of miles away, only minutes earlier, Rachel Evans had activated Protocol 7 with a single secure request. The corporate human resources director had joined the call first, then legal, then corporate security. Finally, the regional director responsible for every property in the district. No raised voices, no dramatic speeches, just experienced professionals reviewing live security feeds, employee access records, and internal communications in complete silence. Every passing second added another verified fact to the growing file. Back inside the hotel, Greg Harrison continued believing he controlled the situation. He straightened his jacket and looked toward the gathering crowd with a confident smile that now appeared increasingly forced. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "we appreciate your patience while we maintain the standards expected from this property." His words were met with silence. The guests were no longer interested in polished hospitality language. They were watching people, not policies. Emily Carter quietly stepped away from her terminal and approached the security officer. Keeping her voice low, she said, "Please do not ask her to leave until someone from corporate arrives. I am certain there is executive authorization connected to her profile." The officer nodded almost imperceptibly. "Thank you," he replied. "I was already beginning to think the same thing." Greg noticed the brief conversation and frowned. "Is there a problem?" The officer answered respectfully, "I believe waiting a few more minutes would be the wisest course." Greg exhaled sharply. Waiting only rewards people who refuse instructions. Naomi finally looked toward him again. Sometimes waiting allows the truth to catch up with assumptions. A woman standing beside the concierge desk smiled faintly at those words. Her husband whispered, "She has handled every insult with more grace than most people could manage." Nearby, another guest quietly lowered the phone he had been using to record the exchange. What had started as curiosity had become concern. The atmosphere in the lobby had changed completely. Employees who had avoided eye contact earlier now seemed uncertain about every decision that had been made. Even the fresh scent of flowers and polished marble could not disguise the growing tension hanging over the room. Naomi's phone vibrated one final time. She glanced at the message for less than a second. Rachel had written only 3 words. "Team has arrived." Naomi slipped the phone back into her pocket without the slightest hint of satisfaction. This had never been about proving herself. It had always been about revealing the cost of judging another person before learning the truth. At that very moment, beyond the lobby doors leading from the executive corridor, several measured footsteps echoed across the polished floor. They were calm, deliberate, and unmistakably purposeful. Emily heard them first and instinctively turned her head. The security officer followed her gaze. Several guests looked toward the hallway as well. Greg remained facing Naomi, unaware that the confidence he had displayed throughout the morning was about to meet a reality he had never considered. The invisible shift that had been unfolding since Naomi sent a single message was no longer hidden behind corporate systems and private communications. It was walking directly toward the lobby, bringing with it every answer no one had been willing to seek before making their judgment. The footsteps grew louder until every conversation in the lobby faded into silence. A sharply dressed man in a dark navy suit entered from the executive corridor, followed by 2 members of the corporate operations team. His pace was steady, but the expression on his face carried unmistakable urgency. Emily recognized him immediately from the company training materials. Daniel Whitmore, regional director. Greg smiled with visible relief. "Perfect timing," he said as Daniel approached. "We have been dealing with a difficult situation involving an unauthorized individual." Daniel did not answer. He continued walking straight past Greg without slowing down. The entire lobby watched as he stopped directly in front of Naomi Brooks. Without hesitation, he extended his hand. "Good morning, Ms. Brooks," he said respectfully. "I sincerely apologize for what you have experienced this morning." The words landed with the force of complete silence. Greg's smile disappeared. Emily closed her eyes for a brief second, knowing her instincts had been right from the beginning. The security officer immediately straightened his posture. Several guests looked at one another in disbelief. Naomi accepted the handshake with the same calm dignity she had shown since entering the building. "Good morning, Daniel," she replied warmly. "Thank you for coming so quickly." Daniel nodded. "The executive team has been reviewing everything through the live security feeds. We have the full timeline." Greg blinked several times before forcing out an uneasy laugh. "There must be some misunderstanding." Daniel slowly turned toward him. "There is no misunderstanding." Greg looked from Daniel to Naomi and back again. "Who exactly is she?" Daniel held Greg's gaze for several long seconds before answering in a clear, measured voice that carried across the entire lobby. "She is Naomi Brooks, founder and chief executive officer of Brooks Hospitality Group. She is the owner of this property. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the quiet background music seemed insignificant against the weight of those words. The businessman who had defended Greg lowered his eyes in embarrassment. The woman standing beside the concierge desk covered her mouth in disbelief. Emily felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief because the truth had finally been spoken. Sadness because it should never have required a title for someone to be treated with basic respect. Greg's face drained of color. He searched for words that refused to come. I did not know. Naomi looked at him with quiet compassion rather than triumph. You are correct, she said softly. You did not know, but you decided before you learned. Greg glanced toward the front desk, where Naomi's driver's license still rested beneath the monitor. He reached for it with trembling hands and carefully walked toward her. I am very sorry, he said quietly as he returned the identification. Naomi accepted it without anger. Thank you. Daniel looked around the lobby before addressing everyone present. Our company was built on one principle above every other. Every person deserves dignity before verification, not after it. Several guests nodded in agreement. The security officer stepped back respectfully. Emily could feel the atmosphere changing once again, but this time it was no longer driven by assumptions. It was driven by truth. Greg remained standing in complete silence, finally understanding that the most important lesson of his career had arrived in the form of the very person he had refused to welcome through the front doors only minutes earlier. Daniel Whitmore turned slightly toward the members of the corporate operations team, and without raising his voice, he gave a simple instruction. Please begin the formal review. One of the executives opened a secure tablet, while another quietly connected to the corporate conference line. Within moments, the director of human resources appeared on the screen. We have completed our preliminary review of the security footage, employee statements, and access records, she said. The findings are consistent across all sources. Greg Harrison stood motionless, the confidence that had carried him through the morning completely gone. He looked toward Naomi Brooks, searching for some indication that this could still be explained away. Instead, he found only calm patience. The human resources director continued. Mr. Harrison, you denied entry to the owner of this property without verification, retained her identification without proper authorization, disregarded concerns raised by an employee, and failed to follow the company's hospitality and respect policies. Effective immediately, your employment with Brooks Hospitality Group is terminated. The lobby remained silent. There was no celebration, no applause, only the unmistakable weight of accountability settling over the room. Greg lowered his head. I understand, he said quietly. Daniel nodded once. Your access credentials have already been deactivated. Someone from Human Resources will assist you with the remaining administrative process. Greg instinctively reached into his pocket for his electronic access card. The small indicator light that normally flashed green remained dark. For the first time that morning, he realized every decision he had made had become part of a permanent record. The security officer stepped forward, not as an act of force, but as a professional gesture to accompany Greg through the standard departure process. Greg paused before leaving and turned toward Naomi. I judged you before I knew anything about you, he admitted. I cannot change what happened, but I am sincerely sorry. Naomi met his eyes with quiet sincerity. I accept your apology, she replied. I hope today changes more than your career. I hope it changes the way you see people. Greg gave a small nod before walking calmly toward the employee corridor. As the doors closed behind him, the tension that had filled the lobby finally began to fade. Daniel turned toward Emily Carter. Ms. Carter, thank you for speaking up when something did not feel right. Doing the right thing is not always the easiest choice, especially when you are new. Emily looked almost overwhelmed. I only wanted us to verify the facts before making a decision, she answered. Naomi smiled warmly. That is exactly how respect begins. Several employees quietly nodded, reflecting on the lesson they had witnessed. The businessman who had spoken in support of Greg earlier approached Naomi with visible embarrassment. I owe you an apology as well, he said. I accepted someone else's assumptions instead of forming my own judgment. Naomi offered him a gracious smile. The important part is recognizing it when we have the chance to do better. Around the lobby, conversations slowly resumed, but they sounded different now. People greeted one another more thoughtfully. Employees welcomed arriving guests with renewed attention. The atmosphere that had once been defined by suspicion now felt grounded in humility. Daniel looked across the elegant lobby and said softly, "A luxury property is remembered for more than beautiful architecture. It is remembered for how people feel when they walk through the front door." Naomi quietly agreed, knowing that the most meaningful renovation any hotel could ever make was not found in marble, crystal, or polished wood, but in the character of the people entrusted to welcome every guest with equal dignity. The lobby slowly returned to its familiar rhythm, but no one standing there would remember that morning because of the polished marble floors or the elegant chandeliers. They would remember the lesson that unfolded beneath them. Naomi Brooks looked around at the employees who had gathered near the front desk. Some stood with quiet reflection. Others seemed determined never to repeat the mistake they had just witnessed. Daniel Whitmore stepped back, allowing Naomi to speak without interruption. She rested one hand lightly on the front desk and smiled gently. "Every hotel in our company was built to welcome people," she began, "not to measure them before offering respect." Her voice was calm, yet every word carried through the lobby with unmistakable clarity. Luxury has never been about expensive furniture, beautiful architecture, or five-star ratings. Luxury begins the moment another human being feels safe, respected, and valued. The employees listened without moving. Emily Carter stood near the reception desk, still processing everything that had happened over the past few minutes. Naomi turned toward her first. "Emily, thank you for trusting your principles even when it was uncomfortable. A company becomes stronger every time someone chooses integrity over convenience." Emily smiled with genuine gratitude. "I only followed what I believed was right." Naomi nodded. "That is exactly how great cultures are built, one decision at a time." She then looked across the entire team. "Titles tell people what we do. Character tells people who we are. Never confuse the two." Those words settled deeply into the room. Even the guests waiting to check in remained quietly attentive, understanding they were hearing something far more valuable than an ordinary corporate statement. The businessman who had apologized earlier stepped forward once again. "I will remember today for a very long time," he admitted. Naomi answered with kindness. "Then something good has already come from it." Daniel informed the staff that additional training focused on hospitality, unconscious bias, and respectful guest service would begin the following week, not as punishment, but as an investment in the culture the company wanted every property to reflect. Several employees nodded with sincere appreciation. They understood that meaningful change required more than replacing one manager. It required changing habits, expectations, and daily choices. Naomi took one final look around the lobby before walking toward the executive elevator. This time, every employee greeted her with genuine warmth, not because they had learned she owned the building, but because they finally understood that every person who walked through those doors deserved the same welcome. As the elevator doors quietly closed, Emily glanced at the entrance where the morning had begun. New guests continued arriving, carrying luggage, briefcases, coffee cups, and travel plans. None of them knew what had happened only moments earlier, and that was exactly how Naomi wanted it. She had never come looking for recognition. She had come looking for truth. Outside, the clouds that had gathered over the city were beginning to break apart as sunlight reflected across the glass entrance. Inside, the atmosphere felt lighter than it had all morning. Policies could shape procedures. Buildings could impress visitors. Success could build remarkable hotels. But only respect could build lasting trust. And from that day forward, everyone who had witnessed those unforgettable 8 minutes understood one simple truth that would stay with them long after they left the lobby. Never decide the value of a person before you learn their story, because dignity is not something earned after recognition. It is something every human being deserves from the very first hello.